The film which you are about to see is an account of the disaster which befell 5 cave explorers in Alabama. Originally from Tallahassee, Florida, best friends Tom Harris and Paul Leahy loved to go spelunking on their spare time. So when they were both lucky enough to have a free weekend together, they decided to make the 6-hour drive north to a system known as Moses Tomb Cave, which itself is located in DeSoto State Park, which is about an hour and 30 minutes from Birmingham, Alabama. The cave system itself is surrounded by a thick forest on the side of a small mountain known as Fox Mountain. Once you locate the cave itself though, you might notice that the entrance is an unassuming hole that runs about 2 feet by 4 feet, or 60.9 centimeters by 1 meter long. A nearby tree is also normally used as a primary rigging point to give the people descending down more safety. Once you squeeze past the entrance, the cave opens up into a 15-foot or 4.5 meter sheer drop into a room that's about 40 feet or 12 meters in diameter. Offset to this, about 5 feet or 1.5 meters is then a large hole that leads to a 230-foot or 70-meter freefall that's about 40 feet or 12 meters in diameter also. Essentially, if you aren't ready to do some climbing, you might find out why they call this cave a tomb, which now brings us back to our story. The 2 friends Tom and Paul were also planning on meeting up with 3 other friends from the local area who also loved to go cave exploring. Amongst them were Pat Lancaster, Art Gala, and Howard Cobb. When the 5 friends finally met up at Moses' Tomb, their plan was to do what's called bouncing the pit, where you just rappel all the way down to the bottom and simply climb back up. Sounds easy enough, would you agree? Well, on October 28, 1990, the 5 men made their way through the forest, and thanks to the signs posted along the trees, were able to find the incredibly small entrance. And as soon as they got there, they began to prepare for their descent down. They started by preparing the rappel rope inside the cave and by helping each other get outfitted with the proper equipment to efficiently rappel and equally climb back out again. Tom was planning on leading the descent, but at the last minute started having light problems, so they decided to let Howard lead the way. He was a little nervous though, as this would only be the 3rd time he's actually rappelled into any cave. So determined and brave, he straps on his harness and starts to squeeze through the entrance. As he was rappelling down, he was doing pretty good, but then began to notice that not even his large headlamp was bright enough to light up the entire sheer drop. And so for most of the descent, he was just descending into pure darkness, though still being able to see at least his hand in front of his face thanks to his headlamp. Though luckily he was able to find the offset corridor and nothing happened, he was then able to reach the bottom and give an all clear to his friends back up top. Once they were all ready, Tom then hooked his harness to the rope and began his rappel down as well. As he was beginning his descent down, everything was going to plan, but then all of a sudden, after he hit the offset corridor, Tom's harness snapped, and without warning, he fell about 100 feet or 30 meters to the cave floor. Luckily though, he wasn't dead, so he gathered up enough strength and yelled out for help. Just then though, without hesitation, Howard ran over to him to make sure he was okay, and to continue yelling out for help so Tom didn't have to. Meanwhile, back up top, the last 3 friends knew something bad had just happened, but weren't sure exactly what it was. And so Pat and Paul ran back to the cars and drove back to the nearest town to get some help, while Art stayed behind making sure that they didn't need any extra help. Just then, Tom's speech started to sputter, and he started to have small back-to-back seizures. So Art made the decision to also descend into the cave to see if he could do anything else to help. Though luckily, as soon as he made it down, Tom began to regain consciousness. And so when he made it down, Art and Howard began to look at Tom more thoroughly together and found out that Tom had a fractured left leg. On top of that, he was also complaining on the fact that both of his legs were now numb and he couldn't feel them. Which now meant, unfortunately, Tom really was stuck at the bottom of this cavernous pit. Luckily though, he still has friends around him, and so Howard would tear a piece of his shirt off in order to stop the bleeding coming from both his legs and back. Meanwhile, Pat and Paul were finally able to reach the nearest telephone, which was a long 15-minute drive to the nearest truck stop. They were then able to make the call to the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department at around 11:40 a.m., which then immediately dispatched their local rescue squad to the scene. A local cave rescueman by the name of Ricky Little was also called to the scene to see if he could help any. The dispatcher even went as far as calling in the Chattanooga-Hamilton County Cave Rescue Team to see if they could help any as well, but unfortunately their station was some 50 miles or 80 kilometers away, so they would have to get there when they got there. Meanwhile, back in the cave, Tom started to complain about not being able to feel his legs again, which he says while shivering and shaking. Luckily for him though, the first rescue personnel are starting to show up and set up outside the pit, though unfortunately they still don't have the right equipment to repel such a deep pit and rescue him, so they have to helplessly wait for more help to come. After about 30 minutes though, the correct equipment arrived and everyone was able to get ready to save Tom. By this time though, 2 hours had already passed since the accident, so Tom's condition was starting to worsen as time went on. So that's when a paramedic by the name of Anthony Clifton decided he'd be the first one to rappel down. That way, he could provide aid as more help made its way inside the cave. When Anthony was able to finally make his way down, he began to assess the scene at hand and noticed Tom wasn't talking anymore and had the general appearance of someone being in shock. There was also a considerable amount of blood on the surrounding rocks, and he was also very pale in color, with a very rapid pulse. So Anthony began to help him as fast as he could. Meanwhile, back up top nearby, a man by the name of Jerry Smith, who just so happens to be an expert in rope rescue, was nearby teaching a class. They heard about the situation and decided to head on over to see if they could help. And lucky enough, Jerry's class were then able to rig up the mechanical advantage system needed to haul up the stretcher in less than 30 minutes. And it was on its way down. Paul then decided to rappel down as well in order to get better communication tools to Anthony. That way he would be able to talk to his peers on the top a lot better. As soon as Paul got to the bottom, they also began to lift Tom onto the backboard and tried their best to stabilize him. Finally though, after about 3 hours from the initial incident, the rest of the rescue party finally shows up and begins to get ready to pull Tom out of the pit. Among them was another man experienced in cave rescue by the name of Dennis Curry, who then also rappelled down to help hoist Tom out of the massive hole. Because of his injuries though, they had to raise him up extremely slowly, almost 1 inch a minute, as to keep him as level as possible. And they also had Dennis climb slowly side by side with him as to provide extra safety. When the stretcher made it to the incredibly tight entrance though, they ran into some trouble. So very carefully, Dennis got underneath the stretcher and they managed to maneuver Tom upright, and luckily he was skinny enough to be able to squeeze through. Almost 6 hours after the incident, Tom was then flown to Erlanger Medical Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee, about 48 miles or 77 kilometers to the north of the cave, in order to get him the best medical attention possible. When they got there, they concluded that Tom suffered a crushed vertebrae in his spine, which was partially paralyzing him from the waist down. Tom was then hospitalized for about 2 weeks, with several weeks of therapy ahead of him, but miraculously, on December 2nd, 1990, 6 weeks after the incident, he was able to take his first steps, with a lot of his friends and family in his corner to help him get back to health. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you had found yourself in Tom's shoes, and you had fallen over 100 feet to the bottom of a cave floor? Or better yet, what would you have done if you weren't with friends and you had fallen completely by yourself? And once again, thank you very much for watching another video. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and hit the notification bell for more content in the future. Goodbye for now.